Thanks, Anita, and thank you to you and to the whole team at CMS. It's really fantastic. This conference has been so great over the last couple of days, and I'm really excited to be here and to be sharing the session with you all. Just a little bit of background about me. My name is Kenigsberg. I am an Orthodox rabbi. I currently live in London. Grew up in South Africa. Went through Israel, and as I said, currently based in London. And my interest in the space is I've been studying in rabbinical seminaries in yeshivot in Israel for studying religious texts for many years. And I've been fascinated by the application of religious law, of ancient religious law, to modern technological innovations. And this is a field which is growing all the time as technology develops, by the day, by the hour, and has applications in so many areas in the world of medicine, in technology, in AI, in ethics, and all sorts of things. And of course, in food. And for the last few years, I've been focused on this idea of cultured meat, of how and looking at what kind of role religion can play and will play in this. So the topic of today's talk is regulating cultured meat for faith communities. And just by way of introduction, I want to talk a little bit about why this is so important, why this is a question and why everybody should care. Everybody who's here, whether you're part of a faith community or not. So the first thing just to point out, these stats come from an article from Chris Bryant. It was published earlier this year, aptly named Culture, Meat and Cultured Meat. And he talks about, what kind of a population are we talking about? What kind of a market where there are faith communities where there are going to be specific dietary requirements and specific dietary laws which are going to influence the regulation and the consumer acceptance of cultured meat. So as you can see here, this is an issue for the world's 1.8 billion Muslims, 1.1 billion Hindus, 500 million Buddhists, and over 10 million Jews. So we're looking at almost half the global population. It's not to say that each and every one of these individuals is going to necessarily see themselves as bound by these rules and these specific religious customs. But nonetheless, this could affect a great proportion of the world. I'm going to be talking specifically about kosher, which is how it's going to affect Orthodox Judaism. But as you can see, this is going to be a question for Muslims and for others as well, those communities that have specific dietary laws. Just to show how this is going to affect, as I mentioned, not every member of these communities necessarily sees themselves as bound by all these rules. But if you look at Israel, for example, Israel, which has been mentioned already in this conference, I know we had a speaker yesterday and today as well coming up from Aleph Farms. If you look, this is from a survey which was done by the Pew Research Institute. You can see this was done from the entire Jewish population of Israel. You look at the graph on the left, tells us that almost 2/3 of those people, that includes those who don't see themselves as religious, but would keep kosher at home, i.e. they would see themselves as bound by the Jewish religious dietary laws. Even more than that, the graph on the right, you see that over 80%, and that includes those who wouldn't keep kosher necessarily with other ways, but would not consume pork. Pork is going to be one of those things, we'll talk a little bit more, that's not going to be permitted for kosher consumption. So this is going to affect a lot of people. That's in terms of the kosher world, that's in terms of Israel. Of course, this isn't just a question for Israel, and Israel is significant because as you can see, a majority of the population of that country, this is going to be an issue. But not just Israel, around the world, these are signs from Kosher Fest, which is, this took place earlier this year. It's an annual kosher exhibition which takes place every year in New Jersey with over 6,000 attendees. And a few statistics that shows why kosher is going to be important, not just for the Jewish Orthodox population, but for other people as well. You see over here, only 2% of Americans are Jewish, and yet 41% of all packaged food in the US is certified kosher. Looking at how big this market is, projected to get up to $60 billion by 2025, so it's a massive increase. And why is it that so many are trying to get into the kosher market? So this comes from this article from the BBC. The bottom line tells us that explanations include a perception that kosher food is cleaner or healthier. That perception, whether that is correct or not, kosher is to do with rituals, to do with religious law. It's got nothing to do with necessarily the fact that it may be cleaner or healthier. Maybe it may not be. But that's a perception, and therefore, for a cultured meat brand, if we're talking about consumer acceptance, we see that people do have this perception about kosher food. So certainly, having that kosher stamp on as well is going to be something that would help. That would help market. That would help increase the consumer acceptance in this field as well. I just want to reiterate a point, which is that when we're talking about these faith communities, we're talking about the Orthodox Jewish community that's bound by kosher rules. This is not a preference. We're talking about consumer acceptance. We talk about taste. We talk about appearance. We talk about cost. All sorts of factors which may be a recommendation, may be very, very important, but this is more than just that, because this is going to be prohibitive. For me, as an Orthodox Jew, if it doesn't have the kosher stamp on it, I'm not going to eat it, no matter what, no matter how good it looks. So that's why this is so significant as well. So understanding why this is something which is important, let's talk about how we get there. How are we going to get cellular agriculture? How are we going to get cultured meat to be kosher? And really, I want to divide this into two stages. The first stage I'm going to talk about is actually the second chronologically. But that's the case of certification. Already a lot of people have asked about in terms of kosher certification, how do we get there, who's responsible? And what I want to say is kosher certification, in a sense, is not a unique question to cultured meat. It is a question which any modern food product, any product in the modern food industry would need to go through this process of certification. And it's relatively straightforward. What you can see over here is a number of symbols. People have probably seen one or more of these symbols before on different food items. But these are different kosher certification symbols, different agencies from around the world. You know, the top four you can see here are based in North America. The rest of these is, we've got one from London, one from South Africa, one from Israel. These are just a sample, but many, many different agencies around the world that are responsible for kosher certification. Often the symbol has the K, which stands for kosher, but not always. But there you have it. Now, what happens is these agencies, you know, if you have a company which has a certain food product, they want to get certification, they would approach one of the agencies and they would follow up with them and they would check. What really needs to be done is that there would be an inspection of the ingredients, there would be an inspection of the factory, looking at the equipment, looking at the processing methods, and so long as all of that is in line with the religious laws in order to be kosher, they would get the certification, and that's how it would go. And as I say, this is not a unique problem to cultured meat. This is anything in the modern food industry. Interestingly, many of the plant-based products already do have this certification. And again, by the plant, it's going to be a lot more straightforward for reasons which I will elaborate in a few moments. So this is just an example for you to get a sense. This is from the KLBD, which is the London Rabbinical Court, as one of the agencies. This is from their website. This is how they provide certification to products. Step one, you can see there's an application form. Step two, a quotation. Step three, an assessment. And this is really, they would check the ingredients, would check the manufacturing process to see that everything meets the standards. And then step four would be certification. It's not mentioned here. And again, depending on what the product is and how the process takes place, there may need to be some sort of supervision as well, whether it's constant supervision or spot checks and that sort of thing. But there you have it. And so long as all the ingredients and everything matches up with what kosher law requires, you would get the kosher certification. Now, when it comes to cultured meat, we're not there yet. This is the second step, as I said. And this is a process which is going to take place much later on in the process when we're a lot closer to market in terms of the actual certification and the stamp on the product. But before we get there, there's something a lot more fundamental that we need to talk about. And if the second stage in terms of certification is looking at, as I said, looking at the ingredients, looking at the methods, looking at the equipment, and checking that all of that is in line with what the religious law has to say about these ingredients, the first thing we have to do is work out what religious law actually has to say about these ingredients and about this process. This is not something which necessarily the agencies may be involved in this stage, but this is something which goes to scholars. This is something which goes to the eminent authorities of the age to determine. We're looking at the product, going back to the first principles. How do we view this product? What are the set of rules? What are the set of laws? What are the set of principles that are guiding us in terms of determining what the agency will have to supervise afterwards? What it is that we'll need to check in order for certification. And to talk about this is to understand how complex this is, to understand maybe how tricky this is as well. I want to use CocaCola as a test case, maybe as a case study. Very, very interesting story about how Coca-Cola became kosher, going back to the 1920s. What you can see here, this is a quote from Roger Horowitz. He's a food historian. He has a book about the history of kosher food in America. And this is taken from there, a chapter specifically about Coke, called The Real Thing, How Coca-Cola Became Kosher. And he talks about the problem that happened going back in the 1920s. And he explains, processed food disrupted the stable categories on which kosher law was based through the inclusion of ingredients intended to make these products taste better, look attractive, and last longer. When we get to the modern food industry, all of a sudden, it's not just a case going back. We're talking about food was very, very simple. We're talking about maybe agriculture, maybe talking about animals. All of a sudden, the stable categories are not so clear anymore. There's all sorts of new ingredients that have come about. The rigid categories prescribed by kosher law were no longer self-evident in modern food. And rabbis schooled in pre-industrial Jewish law needed to figure out how to extend these principles to 20th century conditions. They needed not only to apply kosher law to contemporary food manufacturing, but also to ask American food manufacturers to accommodate kosher rules in the manufacturing process. This is where the story of Coca-Cola gets really fascinating in terms of the accommodation that was made and the changes that were made to the rules. But essentially, this is the thing that's been taking place over the last 100 years. The standard categories of kosher food in terms of which animals, which species are permitted, which products, looking at crops and things like that. All of a sudden, we're dealing with enzymes and E numbers and food additives and preservatives and all sorts of things which ancient law didn't say anything about them explicitly because they didn't exist. So what do we do and how do we look at it? And the rabbis were called upon to have a look to figure out how to develop this whole new area of of kosher certification. And the CocaCola story begins with this man. His name is Rabbi Tobias Geffen. He was a rabbi from Lithuania, and he moved to America at the turn of the century. He was originally in New York, and then he went to Atlanta. And in Atlanta, he lived actually quite near to the Coke factory, and he was the natural address. He was a rabbi. He was an authority in the town, and Coca-Cola approached him to find out if they could get certification. The first thing he had to do was he said, I need to see the ingredients. As we all know, not just Coca-Cola, but many companies keep their ingredients a very closely guarded secret. He was able to get access to see exactly what was inside, of course, with a full non-disclosure agreement. And he discovered that there was a problem. And the problem was this molecule, which is glycerine. This was used in Coca-Cola. This is one of the ingredients. And it's possible to source from animals, it's possible to source from vegetables. But at the time, Coca-Cola was sourcing this from animal fats, which would not have constituted as kosher. What Rabbi Geffen said was that he could not approve this product the way it was, that it contained, although it was even in minuscule quantities, because it was an essential ingredient, because it was something which the company was adding in, and then they saw it as an essential part of the product, although it was in very small quantities, this would be problematic, and he would not be able to give kosher certification. In fact, he requested from Coca-Cola that they should change the way that they source the glycerine, and then he would be able to approve it. And that's exactly what they did. They approached the company Procter & Gamble, who was supplying glycerine for Coca-Cola, and they asked them that it should not come from animal sources, that it should come only from vegetable fats. And the rest, as they say, is history. From that day on, Coca-Cola is kosher and is enjoyed by many Orthodox Jews around the world. And this story is so fascinating. First of all, we see the dialogue. We see the discussion that went on between the food supplier and the rabbi in terms of what could be done. And we see even that there was a change that was done in order to accommodate and to make sure that it would be kosher. So when we're looking at cultured meat, the question is maybe not necessarily, is it or isn't it kosher? The question may be, how can it become kosher? And again, not everybody is going to, not every company and not every manufacturing process is going to be able to accommodate these requirements, but some might, and this discussion is going to be very, very important. The other thing that you can see from the story, as I mentioned, we'll come back to it a little bit later, is the fact that there needed to be full transparency, the fact that the rabbi needed to see the ingredients, although they were a closely guarded secret. And we'll see coming into cultured meat, one of the difficulties we have at the moment in terms of coming up with a ruling at the present moment is that there is a lot of information out there which is still incomplete. So moving from Coca-Cola to cultured meat, let's talk about how it can become kosher and what is required and what are the set of principles that are going to be governing it. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there is not a full consensus at this point. This has begun to be explored really in the last 10 years or so. Well, really since the cultured meat movement really began to expand. And there has been discussion. There's been Jewish legal discussion in terms of what the outlook should be. And there are certainly directions of thought which are taking the lead, but as I say, there's no consensus as of yet. And there are a number of challenges to this. What makes it so difficult? And I've listed the three main challenges over here. The first one is that we are dealing with a limited Jewish legal precedent. As I said at the beginning, in this whole area of technology, modern innovations, and when it comes to ancient religious law and applying them to them, we have principles, but it's always a question, and this is going to be the job of the authorities, to find what is the best precedent, what is the closest precedent, what is the thought process, how should we look at this new product. There's obviously no explicit source in ancient text dealing with cultured meat, dealing with cell culturing, cellular agriculture. It didn't exist. But what can we draw on and where can we draw on to find the principles which will govern this? As I said, unsurprisingly, there's not a full consensus on that. There's divergence of views, and that's going to be another difficulty about this, as well as what we've already mentioned, which is the fact that the information is incomplete. And this really is twofold. Now, at this stage, the reason the information is incomplete is, first of all, because we don't have a cultured meat product on the shelves yet. We're moving forward, and we have amazing conferences like this, and we see the technology, how it's developing. We see the advances day to day and year to year. But nobody knows exactly how it's going to look yet. And even different products, different companies, different places in the world, it's going to look different. And therefore, it's a little bit difficult to answer a theoretical question when it's just theoretical. We need to know exactly, practically speaking, what are going to be the proceeds, what are going to be the ingredients, and then we can answer. So that in terms of the information being incomplete by definition, but also even there are certain companies that are further along, there are certain processes which are further developed. Not all of that is public information, and because of that, it's very difficult for those that are trying to make a ruling on this to make a ruling without knowing that. And at some point, sooner or later, and there have been discussions with some of those manufacturing, cultured meat, with some of the scholars that are rendering these rulings to understand a little bit better in terms of what's going on and what the proceeds are. Obviously, things which are not necessarily public information yet, and maybe won't be. So with all those challenges, where does that leave us? I want to say a few more words about incomplete information and a few more words about media hype. This topic has had a lot of, there's been a lot said about it in the last few years. And there's been a lot of hype about certain statements, things like kosher pork, things like kosher cheeseburger, and those kind of things. And we have to be careful. As I said, the incomplete information, the thorough understanding of the scientific process is key here. Certainly the certification can't happen, but even before that, the adjudication of how we look at this cannot happen without a full and thorough, transparent understanding of the entire process. And therefore, if there's an interview, if there's a blog, or if there's a video where people are discussing, and it may be interesting and maybe tantalizing to come up with ideas, why it may be kosher or maybe not, that's not necessarily an authoritative ruling. And so we have to be very, very careful. When we're talking about authoritative rulings here, many statements which have been put out in the media would not be classified as authoritative, even by the ones giving them themselves. This is over here, you can see this from the Good Food Institute, from their blog, a short piece which was written in 2017 about the possibility of this being kosher. You can see there's a video here, there's a screenshot. This is from Supermeat, another company in Israel. The title says, "Clean meat will be kosher." Now, this video was produced in 2017, I believe. A number of rabbis were interviewed. None of them had a full understanding of the process because the process was not complete. It was just kind of to gauge, it was kind of to get an initial sort of thought. So you see initial thoughts saying that perhaps it will be parav meaning that it is not considered meat and will be permitted for consumption together with milk. We'll get onto that soon. Perhaps that you could take the cells from a living animal. Perhaps that it would be, if you have a look at the text at the top, and it's a little bit small. But they quote another rabbi who said that clean meat is clearly parav, not meat for religious purposes, and so obviously kosher. Now that may be the case, but it's not. From an article like this, this is just an initial thought. This is certainly not any sort of certification or authoritative statement. There's another one which went viral in 2018. These are just a couple of the headlines, but this was really picked up by many outlets around the world. Israeli rabbi says lab-grown pork meat is kosher. Israeli rabbi says eating cloned pork is kosher. Again, we understand why this came out and why there was a big hype about saying this. there may be views like that, and I believe that there'll be a minority view if they'll last. But nonetheless, this is not an authoritative statement, and this is certainly not where not the consensus that scholars have reached, certainly at this point. So, what is the consensus, at least where we stand, that scholars have reached, and what do we look at? So, the place to begin is by looking at traditional meat. As I said, when we get to cultured meat, we're going to have to determine what are going to be the set of rules and principles determining the law. But the place to start is looking at traditional meat. What are the conditions that would make it kosher or not? And we can then extrapolate and see where and in what degree those would apply. Does it apply to cultured meat as well? And there are two primary conditions. The first one, in order for meat to be kosher, is that it needs to come from a kosher species. What defines a kosher species, again, is very clearly laid out in ancient religious texts. I put here three categories. We look at land animals. So here, for example, a cow, sheep, goat would all be kosher. Pig is the most obvious example, which is not. But it's governed by a set of principles, essentially ruminants, those animals which chew the cud and have fully split cloven hooves. Those are the two signs. Any animal bearing those two signs would be kosher. Any land animal bearing only one of those signs or none of those signs would not be. That's when it comes to animals. When it comes to fowl, things like chicken and duck are going to be kosher. Other animals, other birds are not. Here, it doesn't go by any set of guiding principles. Here we have a tradition, and essentially we have a list of which birds are going to be kosher and which are not. And we have an oral tradition going back, any bird which we have an oral tradition going back all the way to when these texts were written, that we consider to be kosher. And as I said, chicken and duck are examples of that. Others are not. The third category, I've included fish on the slide as well, although strictly speaking, fish is not considered meat by a Jewish religious law. Fish does not require slaughter. Fish is going to be allowed to be consumed together with milk. It fits into the category of what's called parov, which means a neutral food, neither meat nor milk, and would be permitted for consumption separately with either of the two. But I have included fish on the slide because also by fish, it needs to be from a kosher species. What determines a kosher species of fish is the fact that it has fins and scales. Lack of that would not be. And finally, the last type of species which I have not included on the slide is insects, because insects would not be permitted for consumption. There is one example going back in ancient religious, one exception, going back in Jewish religious law of an insect which would be permitted for consumption, which is a certain species of locusts. Going back to what I mentioned before about the tradition, there are certain communities that still have a tradition as to which species that is, and that would be allowed. But most communities no longer have that tradition, and therefore we would say that locusts as well would not be permitted. But by and large, all species of insects would not be permitted for consumption. So going back to meat, which is we're talking about land animals, we're talking about fowl as well. It needs to be, number one, is that it needs to be a kosher species. The second condition is that it needs to undergo ritual slaughter, what's called in Hebrew as shechita. There will be a condition before the animal could be eaten. We have an explicit ban on eating, aside from meat which would not be kosher, on any flesh or any limb which comes that would be torn off from a living animal. And that's going to be significant as well when it comes to cultured meat in terms of how we define this ban and whether it's going to apply to cells. This is going to be one of the main questions which scholars have been arguing about. I've written here specifically flesh or limbs, and the text make clear that even that a part of the animal which is detached, even if it is a limb which has no flesh, or even if it is bits of flesh which do not constitute a limb, a cell. I think you'd be very hard pressed to find anybody who would say that a cell is a limb. But nonetheless, if it comes from the flesh, it may be subject to this prohibition. So these are the two conditions, ordinarily speaking. When it comes to meat, it needs to come from a kosher species. It can only be after ritual slaughter. There are other side points as well, but those are the primary conditions. And now the question is cultured meat meat? From a religious perspective, from the way that we're looking at this, if we consider it to meat and it would be subject to those same conditions, then I think we all understand where this is going, that it would need to be from a kosher species, and that would need to be slaughtered before the cells could be extracted. If, on the other hand, we were to determine that it is not meat, maybe one or both of those conditions would not be necessary. So how do we view this? I just want to say at this point again, when you say it maybe it sounds like a bit of a strange question. Is it meat? It comes from the animal, so it's meat. But we have to remember that there are many byproducts or derivatives which are sourced from animals, which are not considered meat by religious law. Eggs is one example. An egg, again, now all these things would be subject as well to the requirement to come from a kosher species. In the same way, meat can only come from a kosher species. Any byproduct, any edible byproduct, is going to have to be sourced from a kosher species as well. So eggs come from a kosher bird would be allowed. Eggs come from a non-kosher bird would not be permitted. Nonetheless, eggs are not considered to be meat. Eggs are considered to be fit into that category, as I mentioned before, what's called parov. Milk is an even more striking example. Milk, which comes from an animal, again, would have to come from a kosher species. But milk is certainly not considered meat. In fact, we have a ban on consuming meat and milk products together. They can't be cooked together. They can't be consumed together. In fact, one would not be permitted to derive any benefit from a mixture of the two. So we have eggs, we have milk, we have other examples of things which do come from an animal. And yes, they would have to come from a kosher species, but nonetheless, they would not be considered meat in the traditional sense. And therefore, maybe slaughter would not be required. Right? There is obviously no requirement for slaughter before, it would be impossible before extracting milk or eggs and other such things. So the question is going to be, when it comes to cultured meat, we need to look at the starter cells. We need to look at the source cells that we begin with. And the question is how we view those. And if we view those as meat, as I've already said, it's going to be quite plain where our conclusion is going to end up. Maybe we won't view them as meat. Maybe we'll view them similar to eggs, similar to milk, similar to something else. Or maybe we'll view them as something else entirely. And so there are three broad possibilities to how to view these starter cells. As I said, number one is to view it as identical to meat. It starts off in the we'll talk about where it starts off, but potentially it starts off in the muscle tissue of the animal, starts off as meat, certainly ends up as meat. So many of the talks in this conference and in all these kind of conferences, and so much of the research is devoted to how we're going to get the final product to be as identical to meat as possible in terms of taste, in terms of texture, in terms of appearance, etc. So that's one way to view it. Another way to view it would be to say as a derivative, i.e. it's something which comes from the animal, but it's not necessarily meat itself. I've put here meat or non-meat, because as we've seen, there are certain, flesh is considered meat, eggs, milk, other things which come from an animal are not. So you could have a non-meaty derivative, or you could have a meaty derivative. But so those are two possibilities. The third possibility, and I want to talk about this one for a few moments now, which is very, very interesting. I have to say that it is a minority opinion at this point, and it seems that it will be rejected. But there is a view to say that perhaps we view the starter cells as completely insignificant. What do you mean completely insignificant? Obviously, we will not have anything without them. But from a religious perspective, there's an argument to say as follows. Generally speaking, Jewish religious law doesn't give credence to things which are not visible, which cannot be recognized through the senses. Something that you would need a microscope, you would need a laboratory to know that it's there, would not be subject to prohibitions. And the classic example of this, which caused quite a controversy, but was quite well known in the rabbinic world going back 200-300 years ago. We talk about bacteria. We talk about microorganisms. I mentioned before the different categories of animals, of living creatures. I mentioned the signs that we need in order to know that something is kosher or not. Clearly, microorganisms do not possess any of those signs. And there was a question that was asked when they were discovered, and many wanted to know how could it be that they are kosher, so to speak. All the time we are, consuming, ingesting bacteria. And the question that was raised was not so much a question of are they kosher, but a question of, well, we've discovered them. We know that we're eating them. We know they're in our water, in the water that we drink. We know that they are there. How is it that they are permitted? And also, again, what we're talking about here is something which is not visible to the naked eye. If it's visible to the naked eye, but it's very, very small, you would have to strain to see it. You would, but you could. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about microorganisms which cannot be seen, and there is a principle that anything which which can't be viewed without laboratory apparatus, is not subject to prohibition. That's what we say regarding microorganisms. Would we say the same thing regarding cultured meat? And say there was an argument to say, since the starter cells begin as microscopic, maybe they don't have a status in terms of religious law, and then ultimately they grow into something much bigger, but they aren't subject to any prohibitions and aren't subject to any restrictions. As I said, that is a voice that has been raised, but it's a minority. Ultimately, I think that it will be rejected. The fact is that we may not be able to see it, but we know it's there. We know it's there in the first place, and it's being manipulated in the lab. Certainly, that gives it a subjective significance. It's very difficult to say that it appeared out of nowhere because we know where it came from. There is also a line in the rabbinic reasoning to say that if the product reaches a stage where we then through the naked eye can tell, can recognize that it was there before, even though at the time we couldn't see it, that it would still be prohibited. And that's certainly going to be the case with our cultured meat. So it's in terms of insignificant. Let's go back to the first two categories, which I think are more likely. If we go along with looking at it as identical or very, very similar to meat, as we said already, that would mean that we need the conditions for meat. As you can see over here, viewing the original cells as a meat entity means the normal rules governing meat would apply to it. And therefore, it would need to be from a kosher species, and it would need to have undergone ritual slaughter before the cells were taken from the animal. Again, somebody might ask, if the cells have been extracted and the animal was then slaughtered, that would make no difference to us. The fact is that that they were taken from a living animal, and then there's room to say this would be subject to this prohibition of flesh from a live animal. What if we view it not as meat per se, but as a derivative, whether it's meat or non-meat? And this is the rule which I alluded to earlier. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, which is really the initial sort of corpus of Jewish law, from where it's derived. We have this principle that which derives from any derivative, any food derivative, goes by the species from which it came from. As I mentioned regarding eggs and milk and other things. Therefore, if it is a non-kosher species, the derivative would therefore be non-kosher. The significance, however, if we're viewing it as a derivative, not necessarily as flesh, there is a strong argument to say that a cell is not flesh, and therefore the prohibition of flesh from a living animal would not apply. Nonetheless, the species would still apply, and therefore you would need to source it from a kosher species. So where are we today? As I said, the current consensus, and this has been explored over the last few years. There are certain very eminent rabbinic authorities, world scholars who have expressed a view on this, who are in conversation, in fact, with some of the scientists and with some of those who are developing these products. And the current consensus seems to be that we would look at it as meat or as identical to meat as possible. And therefore, it would need to be sourced, in order for cultured meat to be kosher, it would need to be sourced from a kosher species, no kosher pork. Number two, it would have to come from, there would have to be ritual slaughter beforehand, before the cells are extracted and before the cell lines before the cell culturing begins. And finally, meat, as I said, there is a prohibition of consumption together with milk. And so that would apply as well. I've put this picture here. I'm sure that this picture is familiar to most of the people, if not everybody who's at this conference. This is Mark Post's hamburger. And the reason I put this picture over here is because a lot of the rabbinic literature, which has discussed this over the years, has focused on this specific product. And I think that's significant. As I said, the major question that we're going to be asking is regarding the source of the cells. And the source of the cells is a question not just in terms of the species that it comes from, but where in the animal we're going to source them from. Certainly the first few articles which dealt with this, we're looking at this, we're looking at what had been written about this particular hamburger, this particular cultured meat, and we begin with myoblasts. We begin with muscle tissue, and that's significant because we begin with meat. As we've already said, not everything that's derived from an animal is meaty. So we could potentially have cell sources which are not meat. Muscle tissue we know is meat, but we can think of feather, we can think of hair, we can think of saliva, we can think of different cells which may come from an animal, which by religious law would not be considered meat. And then perhaps, as as I said, in terms of the species, I think we still have to stick with the kosher species, but there may be room to suggest that it could come even from a living animal. Embryonic stem cells is another avenue which in the rabbinic literature has not yet been fully explored. But before it's developed into meat, would that be subject to the same prohibitions? Possibly not. Also, iPSCs, if we're talking about induced pluripotent stem cells, this raises up a whole other issue. We don't have time to go into it so deeply right now. But over there where we are changing the form, essentially changing the form of the cells and reprogramming them back into something completely different, there are precedents in the modern food industry of products, of procedures whereby, not just in the modern industry, but whereby we have a product which undergoes such a significant change that although it was initially prohibited, it then becomes permitted. What's called panim chadashot ba'olakan literally means a new face, but a new shape, a new form, a new entity. And that may be another avenue that's possible to explore. Transparency, as I said, this is going to be key. In order to have an informed decision, in order to have an accurate decision and a scholarly decision, there's going to need to be full transparency for those rabbinic authorities that are engaged in this, understanding exactly what the ingredients are, where the cells are sourced from, how they're sourced, and what the process that takes place is. So just in summary, instead of where we are today, yes, very much in principle, kosher status can be achieved. And as I said, I look at this is not a question of is cultured meat kosher or is cultured meat not kosher. There's a question of how can we make cultured meat kosher. There's not to say that every single company or every single product will be kosher. There certainly will be some which aren't. It's likely only that if it's going to come from a kosher species. A few of the open questions that we have, I said kosher without slaughter. As I said, this is still under development and under exploration, but certainly if we're talking about sources of cells which come from the non-meat parts of the animal, there may be room to suggest that, non-meat sources of cells. One final point, which I didn't really touch on, but I just want to mention, and that's in terms of serum-free media, I know that's been discussed at this conference as well. Another issue, another concern that some authorities had raised early on was the question of serum. Serum which is derived from blood, that's another law which I didn't mention, but under Jewish law, blood is forbidden for consumption. And therefore there was discussion as to whether serum is considered as blood, whether that would affect the status of the product ultimately. At the end of the day, I think as we're moving towards serum-free media, that is a question which is likely to become academic, but nonetheless, that's something else which will be explored in this process as well. Okay, that's it. That's it for the presentation. I'm happy if there are questions.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Kenigsberg. That was really fascinating, and I look forward to moderating our Q&A session. I am Miriam Guggenheim. I co-chair Covington and Burling's Food, Drug, and Device Practice Group, and it's my honor to be asking you a couple of questions that I had in mind, and I see we have a couple in the Q&A box already. So I'll just kick off with one that I've been thinking about, which is, do you have a sense yet as to at what stage the kosher certifiers, the certifying agencies that you mentioned, would need to get involved in order to certify a finished product? Are they just going to come in at the end when someone has sort of packaged up a cell-cultured burger, or are they going to have to be involved in certifying each stage of the production process?
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. That's a great question. I think it's a little bit difficult to answer exactly where this fits in. I think it's clear that it can't wait till the very end. Certainly, the final in terms of certification, in terms of that stamp, there's going to need to be a finished product before one can say this is it. But again, by that stage, it may be too late. So in some instances, I think especially if we're looking at the in two regards, if we're looking at the manufacturing process and if we're going to be making a request and trying to modify things in a certain way, if we see that if the agencies are going to see that there's a process which would not be compatible with kosher law, and you want to modify that, so that would obviously need to be done earlier on. Secondly, even if it is a process which is compatible, once cell lines have already been extracted and have been developed, it's going to be very, very difficult then to go back and restart that. So that's something which the discussion needs to be happening now, I think, in terms of how we make this a reality. The discussion has begun. I can tell you that there are certain agencies, certainly in North America, that have been involved in this. I mentioned plant-based before, and in a sense, it goes hand in hand in terms of some of those agencies that have stepped in and are certifying plant-based materials, also exploring what to do in terms of cell-based as well. I've been involved personally with a few, trying to bridge the gap between those in the cultured meat space and those in the rabbinic world. Trying to have these, get these discussions going now, because I think it can't wait. But it is difficult because, as I said, we need to have that complete information, and companies maybe don't know and may be reluctant, to release too much. So in a sense, the authorities don't want to issue a view without knowing. At the same time, the companies don't release that information. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 where we are right now. But I think so long as there is dialogue and there is open dialogue, it can get to the point.
Fascinating, and I'm glad to hear that those discussions are happening already, and the history that you presented with Coca-Cola was a great way to tee up this issue, even in a much different type of technology. I'm glad to see, gosh, we are quickly getting questions in the Q&A. We have 6 right now. I'm going to go ahead and start reading some of them. So this one I'm going to answer live is asking about Impossible Foods, which developed a plant-based heme as key to their flavor profile. And in the US, there were some issues relating to that were ultimately resolved. The question is, what is the kosher opinion on cultured blood as part of the flavor profile for cultured meat?
Right, so that's a great question as well. So Impossible Foods, again, I think that they do have certification. I
believe they do.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, if we go back to the Coca-Cola example as well, when we're looking at the finished product, the glycerine which we mentioned is it's exactly the same molecule, whether it's coming from the animal source or from the plant source, but we're looking at where it's coming from, and what is it that's gone into it that's going to determine whether that's kosher or not. And I believe that in the same way, so long as we're talking about something which is when it's completely plant-based and culture-based, and there is no source in the live animal, then that shouldn't present a problem.
So this takes us to another question that I'll put before you, and this asks, good morning, Rabbi. I admit I'm disappointed to hear that the current consensus among scholars is that the animal must be slaughtered. Can there still be room to explore cells as parv as a reasonable approach? Will there be more exploration and discussion in this direction? And they also thank you for an informative presentation.
Thank you. That's a great question as well. And as I said, this is being explored, and that's why I'm here giving this presentation. I think you have to remember that in terms of religious law, the default position. The default position is to resist change, and certainly to resist change too quickly. And therefore, in order to reach a consensus, scholars are looking first at, I didn't go into there's maybe a primary argument before looking at whether this is kosher or not. There's going to be discussion as to, is this a technology which should be embraced? Is this something that, you may have heard sometimes there are these sort of philosophical discussions as to, is this going too far? Is this, kind of intervening in the world? There are, in religious quarters, there are some of those discussions. As I said, I mean, the consensus, certainly from my perspective, and certainly from the quarters where I am, is that this is a technology which should be embraced. But it's a case of, it's a case of embracing step by step, and certainly first, scholars are looking for the broadest consensus in order to introduce things, and from the agency's perspective as well. If we look at the OU or StarkEye or all those other agencies which I mentioned before, they themselves will have a team of will be consulting the scholars, the authorities, some of the rabbinic authorities that I've been in contact with as well. And I said, most of them have pointed to the fact to say that no, this will not be parv, this will be meat. There are minority voices that have wanted to say that it's parv, but the agencies themselves would prefer to go with the consensus view, and that's why it's going along those lines. Having said that, certainly those authorities which are much more comfortable to say, if it can be done in a way in which the animal is slaughtered, that's far closer to the traditional sort of kosher meat that we have, and that would be allowed. Is there room for more exploration? Certainly there is, and that's what we're doing, and we're in that process right now of that back and forth of looking at different possibilities and working out whether and how that could be kosher. Again, I think that there's 2 points here as well. It's not necessarily to say that it will be parav. We may come to a point where something which comes from an animal, maybe even coming from a living animal, may achieve kosher certification, but may still be considered meaty, which is a little bit of a paradox. But these are brand new things.
Fascinating. Next question: the cell culture media, or CCM, can be considered feed for the cultured cells. Would the CCM itself need to be kosher certified or approved to yield a kosher finished product?
That's also a great question. So there's been considerable debate about this in terms of, we're talking about feed. We have a similar discussion that's been going on regarding enzymes. That's in the dairy industry. When it comes, if we look at an animal, a kosher animal, the feed of that animal does not necessarily need to be kosher. That animal can eats the food, whatever it is, but the cow itself will still be classed as kosher. So the question is, when we look at the cells, are we saying that the cells are a miniature cow, and that what they're feeding on would therefore be irrelevant? Are we looking at it as, no, these are nutrients and these are materials which would are absorbed, which become part of the cell, which become part of the culture, and therefore would need certification. That is an open question. That is there is a debate amongst authorities about that. At the end of the day, certainly if we're getting to serum-free media, it shouldn't be an obstacle to have products which are certified. And I was thinking, at the end of the day, once we determine what the line is on this, the certification process will include looking at all the ingredients and everything that's been added and having certification on all of those. But again, there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to.
Very interesting. I'm going to take as our next question one that I think follows on to that, asking, can you please talk a bit more about the media or blood? If seen as kosher, would cell-based meat need to be koshered by salting it?
Right. So I'll just give a bit of background there. One point which we didn't talk about is that, generally speaking, I mentioned that blood is forbidden for consumption, and therefore the process when a kosher animal is slaughtered, it goes through a process of salting, of washing, in order to remove the blood before it could be permitted for consumption. So I understand the question to be asking. If we're looking at that blood sort of going into the cells, would it then need to undergo the process of kosher? The answer is no, it wouldn't. The truth is that the only way that we could look at it to be permitted was if we were to say that we are not, that we're not viewing it as part of the animal. Perhaps there's an argument put forward to say that blood is not permitted, but serum, which is again derived from blood, but it's not the same. It's not the same substance, not the same material, and there may be room to say, based on ancient texts as well, and that is not considered blood. And certainly, if that would be the main line to permit it, and if we were saying that it's permitted due to the fact that it's not blood, so certainly no salting would be required.
The next question relates to whether all these considerations that you've gone through would be relevant if the meat in question is pork. So I think you talked about the current consensus being that you've got to start from a kosher animal to begin with. But if that were to shift and we could start with a cell from a pig, how would the rest of the analysis flow? Would it flow similarly?
Yeah. So it's a very difficult one. I think it is a very remote possibility. Again, there are two ways that we could look at it. Theoretically, as I've said, whether we view it as meat or non-meat, or the flesh itself or a derivative, the source species is going to be significant. So to put forward an argument to say that the source species, although that was non-kosher, the final product is kosher is going to be very, very difficult. If we go along the lines of thinking that, because it's insignificant, because it's invisible to the naked eye beginning, and therefore it is, I'm not really sure what you would say. You'd say it's not here. Where is it? What is it? I'm not sure how you would define that. But, if that argument were to take hold, then you might be able to say, okay, it's, whatever it is, whatever the source, that would be allowed. Again, I find that difficult to go along with that line of reasoning. The other possibility, again, which some have suggested, and this is what I alluded to at the end, in terms of the panim chadashot argument, which says, something which undergoes a very significant change, although it began as a prohibited substance, would end up as permitted because of the chemical change that it's undergone, because, etc. Now, that in itself, that principle has been used. There's a long-running controversy in terms of gelatine, in terms of what is needed to be kosher or not, which hinges on that argument. So that, first of all, the argument itself is not accepted by all authorities. Even if it is, there are some who've put forward to say, you begin with the cell, which appears one way, and you end up with a meat product, which is something completely different. It underwent a process of change. Again, I think that's incorrect. I think that's based on perhaps a misunderstanding or a different interpretation into what we're doing here. It's true that we begin with a cell which is inedible and we end up with an edible product. The reason it's inedible in the first place is not because it's inherently inedible, it's just because it's so small and it's microscopic. If it was big, you would be able to eat it. And therefore, I think if we're looking at something like induced pluripotent stem cells, we'll be starting off with something from a feather or saliva or something else, something which is clearly not meat. That is reprogrammed, that then does undergo a change to become meat. So that becomes a lot more interesting. I think there is a lot more room there for exploration. To say from a live animal, possibly even to be parov, not considered meat. To take it one step further and to say to be sourced from a non-kosher animal, from a pig, I think that is going to be a stretch too far for most authorities. As I said, there are lone voices that have said it, but I'll just add in one more point. That's to do with consensus. That even if even if it was determined, perhaps that it may be kosher, I think there are going to be so many voices that are going to be resistant to it that no one's going to want to take on the responsibility for creating that.
Thank you. Next question: could the bioreactors or other equipment be used for both cultured meat and cultured milk if there's standard cleaning, that not koshering, but just usual cleaning between production runs?
Yeah. So again, that is it's a good question, but that fits into a more sort of a technical aspect in terms of depending on what the materials are made of in terms of the equipment and how it works. Many cases abound within the modern kitchen and within the modern food factory, where equipment undergoes a process whereby its status is reset, so to speak, and therefore it can be used for even from non-kosher food, to food. If it's made of the right materials, the equipment if the process is done in the right way, you could have the same equipment being used for a non-kosher line and then for a kosher line, and that's something which the agencies are experts in, and they know how it works, and that they'd be able to instruct any company in question how that could be done, if it could be done.
Next question I think is very compelling. If the cells do need to come from a slaughtered animal, is it sufficient to slaughter one animal and then that cell line is kosher and you could use the cell line for a long period of time for substantial downstream production?
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's not really a question for me. I think that's a question for some of the other people in this conference. What it would require from the kosher front. There need to be supervision. Again, we talk about supervision here. The first stage, of getting those cells, that's going to need to be supervised in one way or another. And then there would need to be mechanisms in place to know, that those are the cell lines, that it hasn't been mixed in with any others, not coming from, from anywhere else. But if the science can do it, then we don't have a problem with that.
We've got one more very interesting question. We've got a bunch of questions that we won't make it to, but I'm hoping maybe in our last minute, although I think this is a big question, I'll ask it. Could the slaughter ritual be moved to some part of the production process? Could we just say we have ritual slaughter at a later point in the production of cell cultured meat?
Yeah, so that's interesting as well. I mean, this has been discussed in terms of, the question's been raised of, from the other end, somebody wanted to suggest that even if the animal had been slaughtered, you might look at the cells as culturing and as growing, and maybe there'll be a requirement for another slaughter, so to speak. But again, the consensus is that wouldn't be required. As I said before, there's not, we wouldn't be able to. If we came to the conclusion that slaughter was not required, then it would not be required. But if it was, it would have to be done before the cells are extracted from the animal.
Got it. Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry we're not getting to all the questions, but I know there's an opportunity on the Slack channel for there to be follow-ups. So I will thank you so much, Rabbi Kenigsberg. This was really fascinating, and I also thank the participants for their active questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miriam.